I am extremely pleased to once again present Greg Sarris to the Holocaust Lecture Series. For a number of years, we were remiss in that we talked about European and Asian and historical events that have nothing to do with where we are. And it's real easy to distance ourselves from that and say it's a European problem, it's an Asian problem, that happened somewhere else. And we were most fortunate 3 years ago that Greg agreed to come and talk about the genocide beneath our feet. Greg is a college professor. In fact, he is a professor here at Sonoma State, but he has also taught at UCLA. And in fact, he's the chairman of the Federated Indians of the Great Rancheria. He was formerly professor of creative writing and literature at Loyola Marymount. Those of you from Los Angeles know where that is. And he also was a full professor at UCLA. He attended local schools, including Santa Rosa JC, and received his BA in 1978 from UCLA, where he also played football. He worked in Hollywood and as a model and an actor before going to graduate school, where he got his Ph.D. in modern thought and literature at Stanford. He returned to UCLA to teach in 1989. The Federated Indians of Great Rancheria were formerly known as the Federated Coast Miwok, and they are a federally recognized American Indian tribe of Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo Indians. The tribe was officially restored to federal recognition by the U.S. government. He co-produced with Robert Redford an HBO series called Grand Avenue. I know some of my students have seen that, and some of you have read the book on which it's based. Well, just as a local touch, Grand Avenue is named after the street that is home to an extended family of 3 generations of Pomo Indians, and fully in keeping with the changes that go on in a culture, no matter what that culture. The older generation tries to make sense of their lives through the old beliefs and rituals, while the younger generation is mostly lost in their various confusions and pain. I highly recommend it to you. I am now starting my second reading of it. So, without ado, I would like to present to you Greg Sarris.
I'm putting my jacket there. Myrna, maybe you can do me the favor of reminding me not to leave it, because I'll as old as I'm getting. It's been a long time since anybody's mentioned my acting career, only because there was no acting career, a very little one. I mean, some of you are old enough to remember the TV show Chips, and I had a small part on that. When they found out I couldn't act, they killed me. And that was the end. That killed my career. So anyway, I want to thank Myrna and everybody for coming here today, for those of you who are taking the class, for caring, and for all my tribal members and some of our staff people at the office. I see you're here, and that means a lot to me. I think it's really important, and one of the reasons I not only agreed, Myrna was very, I think, circumspect in choosing the verb agree, because I think I actually insisted. And so here we are. What I'd like to do today for you is give you a history of the place where you're sitting. A history that's not talked about or understood at all, or very little. As I like to say, the American Indian is the prick in the American conscience. We can say that slavery was horrible, but that we got rid of it, never mind the legacy of slavery. We can say the immigrants chose to come here, so whatever problems, they chose to come here. But it's very hard for American people, especially with their profound sense of entitlement, to deal with the fact that the land they're on may not be, or was not their own, and was taken in virtually all circumstances by blood and force, and at the expense of entire nations. There's no exception to the place where you're sitting today. In fact, and what I'd like to do is go back and give you a little history of the place and then trace the history of our people and bring you up to present. And again, it's going to be I can't go into a lot of detail, but I hope it will be poignant enough for you to get a sense of place. And finally, to talk about why it's important. So many of my students in my American Indian literature classes and ethnic study classes, they feel guilty or angry or mad or feel that we're pointing fingers. That is not my intention, and it's not the intention, I would argue, of enlightened people. We have to get past pointing fingers. What we have to get to is learning what we can from what has happened and be able to understand how we in fact are all here together. Let me start. There was many people here together. Of course, actually where you're sitting right now, in the time of contact, was all underwater. So nobody was living right where you're sitting now. The water table came in here, and during the winter months until about June, this was virtually an inland bay that extended from the bay just south of us, San Pablo Bay. In fact, up until 5,000 years ago, the Russian River used to run directly north to south and empty into San Pablo Bay. There was an immense earthquake 5,000 years ago that actually turned the river. So I guess we're lucky for that. In any event, there were more people in what is known today as Marin, Sonoma, Lake, and Mendocino counties than there was anywhere else in the New World at the time of contact, outside of the present site of Mexico City. Mexico City, as you know, was the Aztec capital. And so there were a lot of people there then. But outside of that major metropolis or city, there were more people here than there was anywhere else. And people don't have a sense of that. In fact, there were also more languages spoken here than there was anywhere else in any other place in this country and in the New World. In fact, most of the old people here spoke at least 10 languages. Some of those as different as English is from Chinese. Now, if I could have, I believe, Daisy, it's map number 2. Go to the next map. Yes. Basically, you'll see here, this is Sonoma. This is the territory, Aboriginal territory of what today is known as the Federated Indians of the Great Rancho Rio. We are comprised of people from survivors from Coast Miwok nations and Pomo nations. If you go to the next map, next map, please. All right. Here you can see our area in before. Each of the names that you see here designates a nation with its own villages. And then you see the southern Pomo that are in our area up there, and then Wapo that are not in our tribal area, but to the northeast of us. But anyway, each of these areas was a nation. Now, there was never any such thing, folks, as Pomo or Coast Miwok. Those are names that ethnographers gave us. They divided us up by language families. What you see in Coast Miwok here, that's a Penutian language family. North of us is Pomo, that's Hokan family. The languages are as different as English is from Chinese, okay? Within the Coast Miwok, there were dialects, but mostly they could understand. For example, the Lakatawit might be speaking what we would know as contemporary English, while the Huiman down south might be speaking Old English. All right, it was that different. But now when you get into the Pomo area, especially when you get up into Lake County here, the languages are radically different. Say the difference between French and Spanish and so forth. So they were mutually you couldn't understand them if you didn't speak the different languages. Now, Daisy, if you go back to the next thing, you can see the number of villages. These are just known villages or Aboriginal sites in the territory. How many people were here, with an average of 200 to 500 people in one of these villages. Some of them were small, some of them were more temporary. Daisy, now if you'd skip ahead and go to a close-up of just the Sebastopol area. Once again, this is just the lagoon, the Santa Rosa. If you go north, you see up there in all along how many people, how many villages were along waterways, along the Laguna right down here, and then up in the Healdsburg area, the Pomo and others. That's how many people were here. All right, the big question that ethnographers and others have is, how did so many people living so close together for at least 10,000 years get along with virtually no physical warfare? Were we stupid? Were we slow? No, in fact, it had to do with an integrated religious, social, political system that maintained a sustainable relationship with neighbors and with the environment that I'm sure was worked out over many, many years. Now it's interesting, I'm gonna jump ahead for a minute, because the old belief was that the California Indians were the dumbest of the Indians. The Westerners who came, including the missionaries, the Franciscan Padres, when they were deciding to come north and build the missions for Spain, they had quite a debate, and they had to consult the Pope whether or not the California Indians were fully human and were their souls worth converting and getting for Jesus and for heaven and so on and so forth. But what happened is, most of you are familiar with Indians what? From the Westerns, the Plains Indians, right? Those on horses. There's a tendency for us still today to see other people and value them in terms of ourselves. The Plains Indians, in fact, one of the most sparsely populated areas of the country, gave the settlers the most trouble because the Plains Indians had inherent in their culture what? Organized warfare. They had organized physical warfare. Where they would have war parties and all that sort of thing and go out and fight and cause a lot of trouble. We had warfare. It was just very subtle. We poisoned you or hoodooed you, right? And that created great respect. Let me talk about that. But again, as I would argue, the Europeans have always had a hard time understanding subtlety. Military nations can't take time to read or think carefully. And they certainly didn't hear. Again, they thought we were dumb. They thought we weren't using the land. Let's go back to the question, how did so many people work this out? Basically, we had a fundamental philosophy that everything in nature had power. Even a rock, a tree, a body of water had power. It had songs that if you violated it, it would come back and get you and poison you. Each person had songs that you wouldn't necessarily know, and that might be good, but if you violated that person, those songs with living power could come back and knock your relatives down the next day. I remember as a kid hearing some of the old people talk, and the old people, they were always dying of a heart attack or stroke, and somebody would die and the old people would kind of chuckle, and then they'd say heart attack or stroke. But of course, what they were really saying is they did something wrong or violated somebody or something, and it came back and got them. Now, many ethnographers say that our culture, the Central California Indian cultures, were predicated on fear and black magic. No, folks. They were predicated on respect, because you were constantly reminded that you weren't the center of the universe. Each thing around you had power equal or stronger than your own. People belonged to secret cults, and you didn't know your wife, your husband, whomever. You wouldn't necessarily even know what cult they belonged to. There was a lot of secrecy, and you had power, and you understood the complexities of nature through these cults. Now, the other interesting thing about a lot of the cults is that it required that you had to abstain from meat and sex for up to 7 years. What did that do? You weren't killing a lot of animals, and you weren't reproducing, were you? It kept populations down. And again, this kind of thing, there was this inherent kind of socio-political relationship that kept people together and kept them from fighting one another. For instance, let's just think. If I came up to you and hit you, I would demonstrate to everybody else that I had no songs or power, wouldn't I? Therefore, it wouldn't hurt anybody to turn around and what? Kill me, because there'd be no retribution. What that means then is that physical warfare was considered the lowest form of power, right? So you would never, even if you were going to hit somebody, you would never let anybody see you do that, because that only meant that you really had no connection to the rest of the universe. If you had connection to the rest of the universe and you did something like that, you were causing disease and it would come back on you. The interesting thing, the Kashaya Pomo people used to call, well, and still do to some extent, the Europeans palacha, or miracles. And I used to ask the old people up there, why do you call the white people palacha? And they said, well, because when they first started coming here, they were chopping down trees and killing animals and killing people, and instead of getting punished, more of them kept coming. We thought they were miraculous. But as you know, today, 150, 200 years later, nobody's miraculous. It's all come back on us, hasn't it? We're all the same. We're all here together. And if you look at the weather that Myrna just mentioned, or lots of the things that are going on, it is that kind of separation from the landscape that continues to get us in trouble. In fact, the cultures of the West that came here were so antithetical and so different, the Indian people here just could not understand the motivation. The landscape, folks, was our Bible. Every point in the landscape, every group of animals, every covey of trees, every creek had stories to teach us and remind us of who we were and how all things were connected. So we took care of the landscape and we read the landscape as our sacred text. All right? Everything was that important. What happened? Let's go to contact. The first, as you know, for those of you who have a sense of the history here, were the Spanish. The Spanish, in a sense, established Missions Dolores in San Francisco in 1776. And if we could go back, Daisy, to that map. They began to come across in the Ohlone area right here. Everywhere you see a cross is a mission. This was established in 1776, and here, much later, Mission San Rafael was established about 5-7 years later as an asistencia, or to help here, because so many of the Indian people, and again, there was mass disruption. So they were taking Indians from San Jose, from all over, into the mission here. The Indian people were exposed to diseases for which they had no immunity, and they were dying left and right. They said, we got to get them out of here. So they built a small mission in San Rafael for all the sick Indians and began taking them here, and that's how Mission San Rafael started. But even around 1810, 1812, the Spanish soldiers, who of course accompanied the Padres, the Franciscan Padres, began working in earnest in the southern Coast Miwok territory, invading the Deepen, the Gualan, the Guasto, and Olummi, and Tamal regions, Omioni around. They began in earnest going up here. As they were moving along, something else was happening besides spreading disease and disrupting the villages. Their horses and their cattle that were accompanying them were spreading dung everywhere, and the dung was filled with oat seed and other foreign species that began to transform the landscape radically. The tall oat grass that you see around here, that's not native. Okay, that was brought by horse shit and cow shit, basically. All the way up through into this area. All right, they began taking people in, and then people began to, you often ask, why didn't all these Indians, if there were so many Indian people, native people here, why didn't they revolt? There was some revolts later on, and I'll talk a little bit about that. In fact, right north of us, who lived on below me there were from the southern Pomo. They were quite hostile and really tried to fight the Spanish and later the Mexicans. But one of the things that was once you were taken into a mission, say from a village that was here, say you were taken here or later taken into here, what were you exposed to? Disease. And what would happen is you wouldn't run away because also your villagers back home wouldn't want you because they knew you were carrying those diseases. All right? So again, the villages and the system began to fall apart. How many people are we talking about at the time of contact? A conservative estimate, folks, of just this area, southern Pomo and Coast Miwok, which comprise the Federated Indians of the Great Rancheria today, a conservative estimate is anywhere from 20 to 30,000 people. Okay, 20 to 30,000 individuals spread up and out through this area. All right. The Spanish, of course, were interested in empire. They saw the land and the landscape as something for profit. Very much at odds with the natives who saw the land as their sacred text, their home, something to maintain, something from which they could not extricate or separate themselves or even conceive of themselves as being separate from. All right? So, again, what continued to happen then, in 1823, the last of the missions, the northernmost mission, was built up there in Sonoma, present-day Sonoma. Okay, Mission Solano. And the Mission Solano not only brought in a lot of our folks, but again, Wapo and other Wintun to the east and other groups that were around. The missions separated men from women, put clothes on us. The first laws, interestingly enough, that were passed by the Spanish in this land were laws against bathing and laws against burning. We did controlled burning, which kept the landscape clear and helped grow feed for the animals and the deer, right? Again, the notion that we just wandered around in peace and love, no, we cultivated the landscape. We pruned the oak trees for the acorns. We knew how many animals were in each of our areas. We took care of them. We took eggs from the quail and left enough for them and also the ducks to reproduce. We knew the landscape in that kind of detail. It was our garden. It was our garden that we were an integral part of and that we cultivated. Again, the garden is beginning to fall apart. Our social systems, our villages are beginning to fall apart. Besides the other diseases that are spreading, smallpox and others, syphilis is beginning to run rampant in our communities. And again, as you know, that's not airborne. So the Spanish padres wishing to teach us a good life didn't always follow that life. They separated the men and women. They took the children. And again, for their purposes of empire, put us to work not only building the missions, but maintaining all the crops and the cattle and everything else that they brought in. A lifestyle that was so radical from anything we knew. In 1810, far away, we didn't have, what's happening all over the world today is happening because of the information systems that we have. In those days, it was far slower. 150, 200 years ago, far slower. In 1810 was the Mexican Revolution. And it was about 1822 or 1823 when the Mexicans decided that they didn't want the Spanish padres to have the mission system, that the Mexicans themselves wanted the land for themselves. So they secularized the missions. They said the missions were going to be owned by the Mexicans. The padres could stay there, but they were going to be owned and run and part of the larger Mexican or Californio system. So by the time we really got affected by that in 1823 or so forth, and by the way, the Mexican people, and some of my friends always correct me, it's Californios or early Mexican people that were here, established a very complicated rancho system, huge estates, and huge land grants were given to relatives and military friends of the governor of Mexico, or of Monterrey, stationed in Monterrey. So his relatives got big pieces of land, 40, 30,000 acres here and there, depending on who you're related to. In this area, we had in 1834 a guy named General Mariano Vallejo, who had connections in Monterey. And he was given a large chunk of land right here where we're sitting. He established his home in Sonoma, and his fort, or his adobe, where he was going to work cattle and so forth, right over here on Old Adobe Road. All right? Now the Mexicans, if the Spanish were bad, the Mexicans, you'd think if there's a bottom, there was a bottom below. The Mexicans, the California Rancho system, created one of the most complicated and horrible slave trading systems that we've ever seen. They took all the men and boys, basically, and sold them away into slavery, sold them, traded them to different ranchos, sometimes as far away as Mexico. And mostly what were left were women, and the women were used as domestics in the adobes or in the Spanish homes or Mexican homes, or more often than not, they were used as concubines and sexual objects. It was generally understood that Indian women were there at the disposal of the Mexican men's sexual needs. Today, most of us in this tribe are the descendants of that kind of relationship. The Mexican period, again, more cattle. The Mexican period, during that period, the landscape changed even more. In fact, during General Vallejo's tenure here, from 34 to 48, when he was in power, until the Bear Flag Revolution, the water table dropped 200 feet. He began dynamiting all the natural dams, the lakes, the rivers, and so on and so forth. Then what happened, interestingly enough, the Bear Flag Revolution. California came. California, as you know, again, history, 1850, right? California becomes a state. The first piece of legislation that the state of California passed was called the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which virtually legalized Indian slavery. It said Indians became the rightful property of whosever land they were on. And therefore, if you had Indians on your ranch or on your property, and you were an early American out here who had settled or squatted on land, you had the right to sell them, trade them, do whatever you want, including with the children. All right, so again, that law, by the way, was not repealed until 1868. 1868, 3 years after the Civil War. We were being bought and sold here after the Civil War. And that's important, again, to remember or understand. The Spanish did set aside 450 acres in Nicasio. They set aside a couple pieces of land for the Indians, feeling that we needed a place to go. And so there was Nicasio, 450 acres right down there south of Novato. And some of us lived there, some of us were there. There wasn't much to do there. But in 1868, when that law was repealed, interestingly enough, the sheriff and other officials from the city of San Rafael, the young city of San Rafael, came and coerced 2 or 3 folks into signing away those 450 acres, came the next day and marched everybody over to Tamales Bay. Marched them away, marched them off the land completely. That was our last piece of land, the last stake we had. 1868 on, folks, we became indentured servants of whosever land we were on. We became homeless Indians, homeless survivors. Around the beginning of the 20th century, more and more people, as you know, continuing today, were flooding into California. The land pieces were getting smaller and smaller, and people didn't necessarily want these Indians around. So they petitioned the federal government, and the federal government created the rancherias. They called the California Indian Rancheria Act. It was to set small pieces of land aside for the homeless Indians of California. They didn't even call us tribes or anything like that, homeless Indians, and they went by area or territory. So in our case, they set aside, when they came in 1922, the agent said, well, there's homeless Indians down here around Marshall, there's homeless Indians around Bodega Bay, and a bunch of them around Sebastopol and scattered in Santa Rosa. So they created the Grayton Rancheria for and this is what the legislation says, for the homeless Indians of Tamales Bay, Bodega Bay, Sebastopol, and the vicinities thereof. And we de facto became a tribe. They said, you're a nation, we're giving you 15.5 acres. They gave some other tribes 39 acres. All these rancherias were created for homeless survivors, whoever was left. We lived there, unfortunately, on the 15.5 acres. Only about 3 of it was inhabitable. But we camped there over the years while we were picking the apples and so forth. In 1958, the federal government decided we got to get rid of all these homeless Indians, or it's too much trouble. Why don't we just give them the opportunity to own their land? We'll take away their nationhood, their sovereignty as a nation, and they can assimilate like everybody else. They should be just like everybody else and assimilate. The best way to do that is let them own their land and be responsible. So what they did, they passed that act. They went around to the various rancherias in this area and throughout the state of California. And the law said that the tribes had to have consensus. If they had consensus, they could give up and own the land privately. Well, when they came to the Grayton Rancheria in August of 1958, we were all out, most of us were all out picking the crops, and there were about three elderly men, neither of whom really understood the law, the legal law, the way it was presented, and the agent said to these men, would you like to own your land? And to some poor Indian people, that sounded good, right? They didn't understand what that meant, that you lost your rights, you lost your statehood, your nationhood, everything else. That was clearly not explained. Furthermore, the men said yes, they said sign here, and the rancheria was terminated. All right, it was over. We lost everything. We were very lucky that one of those 3 men, was able to hold on to an acre, and that was in private ownership, and was then held by his daughter, who is still living there today. And her daughter is Laurel Ross, the vice chair of our tribe, who is sitting right here. And she grew up in the last reservation home on that 1 acre over there. Well, I was a young professor. If you listened to anything Myrna said, you didn't have to, I'm not going to test you on it. In May of 1992, 19 years ago, I was at UCLA trying to get tenure, doing what a professor does, and I got a note from some of the older folks here saying, somebody is trying to put a casino down in Tomales Bay, and it's on the half acre where a lot of our people are buried there. Can you come and help us do something? May of 1992, we reorganized. We came together, the old people, the elders in the tribe. It was wonderful. Many of us have been apart for 40 years. We got together. We looked at each other's family scrapbooks. We saw our relatives there. And it was a renewed kind of spirit, if nothing else, of our unity and our shared heritage. And what we decided to do is let's try to fight. Let's try to get our rights back. Let's get restored. Well, it was an uphill battle. You had all these things you had to prove and all this paperwork and paper trail, and we did it, and we worked through fry bread sales and everything else, and coming up here, and I kept flying up here, I think like once a month or more. And finally, I co-wrote a bill with an attorney, and finally, on December 27th, 2000, President Clinton signed the bill acknowledging that we were illegally terminated, that the tribe never gave its consensus as a group. And we got our rights back. They said, not only do you have your rights back, but you should get land back, a reservation back. The only part is they didn't say who was going to pay for that in wealthy Marin and Sonoma County. Well, we went on, we tried to entertain various kinds of things. Organic food processing, Tillamook cheese, but nobody wanted to buy us land. They wanted us to buy the land and us to build the facility and them just to come in and operate it. Well, we were so nice, we probably would have, but we had no money. There was nothing. We had nothing. So in about 2003, March, April 2003, folks in the tribe began to discuss the C word. That's casino. And that was one of the last things at that time I wanted to get involved in. And I thought, well, we have a very lucrative location. It was very interesting because representatives from Trump and other people were calling me the minute we were restored back in 2000 because of our lucrative location, our access to the Bay Area. But we didn't want to do that. That's not why we wanted our rights back. We wanted to get a line on the federal budget so we could get health, education, housing that other federally recognized tribes enjoy. We were unable to get a line on the federal budget, but we kept applying for grants. The people said we need more, so I went over and over this, and my non-Indian mother guilted me into this. She says, you can't leave the folks now. There's so many good examples of bad examples of Indian tribes getting bad deals from attorneys and or investors. You really need to see what you can do. So to make a long story short, given our lucrative location, I created a cockfight in my living room with all the big people you read about in the casino business, and I said what I wanted. I wanted $200 million up front. I wanted complete control of the development board. I wanted to build the building green, and I wanted to build it union. One Station Casinos was left standing, and we got everything. But more important, why I wanted those things is because this tribe had a vision from day one. If we were going to have a casino, if the shards of Indian blood and history that run through us afford us an opportunity, it has to be an opportunity that will benefit Indian and non-Indian alike. It has to be something that will be shared and make the larger community better. We immediately took that $200 million and started giving it away to environmental restoration. And to this date, even before the casino's built, we have given more to environmental restoration than any single or corporate donor in the history of rich Sonoma and Marin counties. We are currently partnering on 3 parks, 3 systems where we are actively working with those things. And the whole goal of the casino is to position ourselves not to have Hummers or new color TVs, but to position ourselves to be keepers of the land once again. And for a group of people who have been exorbitantly poor and angry, that is taking the high road. And I am so proud of my people for that. We have a democratic government. Despite what you may read in the papers, I am not Saddam Sarris. And the people decide what and how they want to do things. We are also involved in numerous kinds of things with temporary tribal aid to needy families, where we're helping all Indian people can come to our offices and get AFDC and the other things, not just Indians from our tribe, but all Indians in Marin and Sonoma counties. And they're getting GEDs and all kinds of other wonderful things and jobs. We have a graduation every June. Currently, folks, there are 1,000, I have to ask Gene here, 1,264, is that right? Did I get it right? Because I got to keep check every day, see who gets born or dies. But 1,264 enrolled members in the tribe, and I want you to hear this. All of whom are the descendants of 14 survivors. 14 out of 20 to 30,000 people. We all trace our ancestry back to 14 survivors. What's the message here? Why, I asked myself, why does Myrna want me? Why am I part of this series? It's obvious. I don't want to just give you the statistics. But one of the reasons it's very interesting, here in this country, we talk a lot about the Holocaust in Germany because it's safe and we helped fix that. In Germany, when I go there, they love to talk about how awful the Americans were to the Indians. But of course, they forget their Holocaust there. Of course, they come to me and try to identify and say, God, isn't it awful what the Americans did to the Indians? And of course, I like to say, yeah, it was awful what they did to my father's people, but what the Germans did to my mother's people, my mother being a German Jew. That kind of shocks them, so you never know quite where you stand. All right. So the purpose is here, as I mentioned from the top of my talk, American Indians have not had the power. We have been victims of genocide, but we've been disempowered. I like to say until there were casinos, nobody knew there were California Indians. And the old stereotypes prevail. When we're defeated, that is the American Indian, you love to have us in museums. The fallen nature god. Oh, isn't it sad that he's separated from nature? Look at the beautiful basket she weaves and all of that. But the minute there's a question of territory or power, we're wagon burners. Right? Casinos, power, territory, wagon burners. Right? When I was making movies with Robert Redford and writing these books, front page news and interviews about native son. I come back with the casino and I'm the pariah, I'm the devil. People are coming up to me and saying, Greg, you're going to ruin our home. And I say, yes, and you're talking to an Indian. They take a while to register that. But again, the question that we have to look at is what we can learn about place. What do we take from this history? What do we take from this course? Obviously, the things that we shouldn't do again. But there are some things from the ancient culture that we need to think about. Great values. The more different you were in the old culture, the more interesting you were, the more spirit or power. Diversity and heterogeneity were the name of the game. Homogeneity and lack of diversity meant you weren't complicated or interesting. That's the way nature herself is. Complicated, diverse, heterogeneous. The other thing is, how do we all come home? How do we live here? It's not a matter of Indian versus white or any of that sort of thing anymore. We're all here now. How do we come home? How do we be here? How do we quit being scared? We all live by stories. We all live by stories. When I teach my Native American literature class, the students I do various tricks to show them how their preconceptions are always there. That's not bad. But in this culture, largely Judeo-Christian in America, we live by an old story, a text called the Bible. And one of the oldest stories in that Bible is about a group of people who escaped or were freed from slavery and began wandering the desert. What happened? What did God tell them? You're chosen, and I will promise you a home. Now, given the escape from slavery and all of that, that is fully understandable. That is a story we need to live by, because we're homeless. We have to find a home. But notice how that story kept getting replicated. Then with Christianity came what? The same kind of thing. This isn't even our home. Our home is where? Somewhere else. The Muslim religion, Islam, exact same kind of thing. Another world, not here. It's amazing to me, coming from an indigenous perspective, how people who are so similar in their beliefs kill and fight themselves over home. Because we're living in a world where people are homeless, unsafe, and frightened, and using physical force to maintain their home. How do we come home? How do we change the story? How do we get familiar with a place where we're not scared? Well, I think if we look back at the indigenous cultures, and we must use science, we must use the poets, we must use the Jews, the Christians, and everybody else to work together to know and restory and replace ourselves in our home. And this story today, I hope for you, is one of those stories that will give you a sense of the place and the importance of what we have to do if we're going to survive. You know, the sun and the water and everything else is not going to discriminate. I mean, there are those groups, I think those evangelicals who say that they're going to go up in a rapture or something. But I think if somebody goes up in a rapture, a lot of us are going to go up in a rapture. or down in a rapture, however you want to see it. But I think ultimately we have to somehow come together and think, how do we create home? Do what we can with what opportunities with our education to create home and learn what we can. As I close my talk and get ready to give you some questions, I'd like just now, if Daisy, if you would go to the final pictures. This is my great-great-grandfather, Tom Smith. He was the son of Supu, the last woman that we know of from the village of Petaluma. And along with Tom Smith and his brother, Stephen, so many of the tribe have come from Tom Smith. And I would like Tom's descendants and his brother William's descendants in the room to please stand up. Jean is our treasurer. Tooch is our representative at the skip board. We're still here. If you go to the next photo, we have Maria Copa. Her ancestors were taken from Alaguali by Tole Lake, and they were baptized Isidro and Isidra. Her mother was Juana Baptista. Maria Copa then became one of the matrons of many survivors. Are there any Maria Copa descendants in the tribe? Usually, or here. I mean, in the tribe, I know there are. All right, and finally, if you'd go to the last photo, which is of Tom Smith's daughter, my grandmother, great-grandmother, and my father, Emilio Hilario, taken about the time I was created there. And again, there are people here. I mean, the newspaper, and when they were making me out to be a bad guy, they were saying everything, that I wasn't Indian, that she wasn't Indian, and now I guess the latest is they're saying she's black. Fine, whatever. There are people here, including Tooch, who, as a young boy,
I remember Nettie Smith very well.
Remembers her very well, and she had some interesting characteristics that made her memorable. So it was very good that many people remembered her. So again,
than health, folks, really mean.
Yeah, she was well, didn't she threaten to cut your arm off with a knife or something?
Yes, she did.
Steal from her.
You got it right, because he was. She was making pies in Tamales Bay or something, wasn't she?
I stuck a knife in a jam jar and she went nuts. You got to use a spoon. She almost killed me.
So, in any event, we're here, and I want all the Indian people. Also, I'm honored that Mullen Molokai is here. He's from Lake County, and I know you read about Lake County, Pomo, and Mullen is the head, the most important man of Sonoma County Indian Health. And Mullen, we're so honored. That's one of the things, I should just tell you, I'm doing my politics now. I've been talking and began talking with the governor and doing various things. One of the things I'd like to do with the money, instead of just give it to the state to spread around, I think Indian tribes that have a casino need to bring all that money locally to the Indian Health Center and to environmental organizations and everything else. So I'm going to fight for that. And we're going to keep going in that way. In any event, Mullen, it's an honor to have you here, and it's an honor for all the work you've done over the years. Sonoma County Indian Health serves all the tribes. I'm looking around, I have all kinds of folks here, but I also have some intergenerational stuff. Shannon Silva is here with her daughter. Now, this is how old I am. Shannon is here, she's working with us. Shannon, I knew Shannon before she was born. Her grandmother and my grandmother were first cousins, but I knew her mom and dad, and I knew when her mom was pregnant with you, Shannon, and now you have a baby, so I'm getting to be, I guess, an elder. It's quite frightening. But, and I know Shannon's grandmother, Anita, very well, and Anita's been instrumental in so much Indian health. Anita also gave Robert Redford a real run for his money when he was here. He was sitting there wanting to learn about, they wanted Cher in my movie, right? And I said no, and so you resort to gang warfare. And I brought him out to to Shannon's grandmother, Anita. And Anita was eating pie at the dinner table and sitting there and looking at Robert Redford. And she says, Mr. Redford, I'd like to take you down to the river and just lather you up. Well, you know, a lot of our Indian women, we never say fat, we say powerful. Our women are powerful. And Anita is quite a powerful woman, is a powerful woman. And a couple of my other aunties, and then, you know, he wanted to go for a walk up at the Kashaya Reservation. I don't know why people want to go for a walk on a reservation. It's a damn ghetto in the woods, but they think they're going to find spirits or something. I don't know, but Anita said to Robert Redford, Mr. Redford, I don't think that's a good idea. She said, us women up here, we don't get to town much, and we wait in the bush for strange men. He was so frightened, he wanted 10 people to escort him to the car. Anita also said to him, take a good look at us, we ain't Cher. Needless to say, went back to Hollywood, and we didn't get Cher, so always resort to your family. I will now thank you for hearing me out. Thank you for caring and being here. I'll entertain questions. I love to talk. I don't know how much time I have, Myrna, but Good. Okay, yeah, did you hear that? Oh, Myrna's really smart. I love that. A seasoned professor. Anybody who asks a question will get an exam. I used to say gold star, and nobody believes that anymore, Myrna, so that's what I ought to start doing. Questions? Questions? Yes, sir.
I was wondering earlier, you mentioned the social, political, religious order of the Satisfies and the Southern Commonwealth. I was wondering if there's a name or a specific term for that religious group or no?
That's a good question. The question is, and I'll repeat it for everybody, and correct me if I get it wrong, but was the socio-religious political system that we had, is there a name given to it? More often than not, no. There was basically a decentralized kind of religious system. And what it is, you know, we didn't argue. If there was a guy across the creek or in another tribe who had a very different way of doing things, first of all, we didn't mess with him, but equally important, we figured maybe we get sick or need him in some way. So again, to do an analogy, if we were one religion here and somebody across the creek was another, instead of wiping him out and dominating, we would say, wait a minute, we might need that person someday. Okay, so there wasn't one prevailing narrative that said right from wrong, that kind of thing. Okay? Good question. Other questions? Other answers? Yes, yes.
When all the nations got combined into the Rancheria, you said, how did they choose what language was spoken?
Well, good question. When they all got put into the rancherias, if you just jump back go back, Daisy, a couple points. Yeah, right there. That would be good. By then, what they would do is often they were speaking Spanish or English to some extent. That was 1922. And remember, there had been so much loss by that point. But there were miraculously many people. The last Coast Miwok speaker of the Coast Miwok from down below this area passed away in 1978. But, interestingly enough, today we have revived the language, and for the first time since 1978, we are having conversations in Coast Miwok in the office. Yep. In fact, the young people do really well, naturally. Us old people, I don't know. Jeanette's from the Sebastopol area. Yeah. Okay, so again, what they would do is when they were put together, they would speak Spanish or English. There would be certain folks, Jeanette's grandmother, for instance, who often just spoke the Indian language and Spanish because of the long history of the Spanish connection. So again, Tom Smith, who you saw, had a very difficult time with English, but was fluent in Spanish and a couple of the Pomo languages as well as the Coast Miwok language. But he was born in roughly 34, 35, and died much later, 100 years later. He was about 100 years old, huh?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well over 100.
Well over 100. He had 42 children. Yes.
That's partly related to all the Indians.
He was a medicine man. I mean, this is true. He was a medicine man. Of course, the joke in the families is that they called him Dr. Feelgood. But he had women basically in every rancheria, and wherever he went around, he had families. So we all are pretty much related. And in fact, in modern times, in the latter part of the early part to the latter part of the 20th century, many of us married Mexicans, Filipinos, Italians, and others. Otherwise, you'd be marrying your cousins. So that's what we did. In fact, the Filipino admixture here is very prevalent. The Manongs, the first generation who came here, they passed the anti-miscegenation laws. They could not marry a white person. And so the only women they had access to were the California Indian women. And they married many of us, including myself. My grandfather was Manong, first generation Filipino. So in our blood is the history of everybody who's come here. Yes?
Could you give a little history on the Cheyenne reservation up in Stewart's Point? When did that?
Okay, the Kashaya Pomo Reservation up at Stewart's Point. I'll be brief because I always like to let the Kashaya folks speak for themselves. We're very careful about what we talk about, but I had, as a kid, had quite a bit of experience up there, and there's a lot of Smiths up there that are related to us. Basically, they were on the Hop Ranch. That was where the Russians colonized. They were taken into Fort Ross, along with many Coast Miwok, by the way. And the women were used as concubines for the Russian sailors or folks, and also for the Aleut and other groups that were there. In fact, many of the people, including Tom Smith, whose name was Tomas Comtechal, was the product of a Coast Miwok woman and what they used to call a Creole, somebody mixed with Kashaya Como, Aleut, and Russian. All right, he became the last great medicine man of us. So again, as I always like to say, and I need to say this, blood does not presuppose point of view. Condoleezza Rice, case in point. Okay, so again, people always say you're Indian, you must be into nature. Well, that always cracks me up. If you're breathing, you're into nature. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. You hug trees or hump gopher holes. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. But in any event, the Kashaya Pomo were at Fort Ross. The women, and this began a culture up there, the women worked as domestics and worked in the orchards and also had children who they raised there from either the Creoles or the Russians. Meanwhile, their husbands stayed mostly up in the villages because the husbands weren't used, and the husbands let this kind of relationship go on. And the Indian children that they had from their Indian husbands stayed up in with the men, being raised by the men. Well, as you know, the Russians abandoned the fort in 1842. Because why? They killed all the seals, the sea otters. They killed all the sea otters, and they had a pelt trading arrangement with China, and they could no longer support the colony. So they took off, leaving the Indians. And Supu, our great-great-grandmother, who was there, went down, and what happened when they left the Indians there, they became prey for what? The marauding Mexican and early Americans, slave traders, who were coming in and getting them. Supu went down and became the maid/mistress for Captain Stephen Smith, and took her 3 Comtechal children, or 4, and named them Smith so that they wouldn't be taken or captured. And then she ended up having Smith children. So we all go back to her, it's biblical, but a woman this time. Anyway, what happened was, then the Indian folks eventually ended up on the Hop Ranch. Charlie Hop had a big ranch up there, and he was waiting for his wife to come from the east. So he took an Indian woman named Molly and had children from her, and she said, in exchange for you using me, can my people live on your land? So it brought the people there. She had the children from Charlie Hop, and then they were there. Again, went from Molly to Rosie Jarvis, and all the way down through Essie Parish, and the whole big group up there that were there all go back to Molly, this woman once again. This one Indian survived woman up there. They gave the Kashaya people a rancheria at the top of the hill in
1912, but they didn't really move there until about 1914 or 1960, up from the hop ranch. Now, it had no running water, and the Kashaya are very interesting because they were isolated up there, and they had very strong religious leaders, women who were part of the Boli Maru, the resistance cult, who preached, abstinence, stay away from white people's the devil, all that kind of stuff, a nationalistic religion. In fact, when they were offered better land, because there's no running water up there in the summer, when they were offered better land down below in the Healdsburg Valley area, they said no. She wouldn't let them go because she didn't want them mixing with the whites. And so Annie Jarvis really ran the show. They did not get running water up there until Robert Kennedy landed there. And he was a big deal. He landed in a helicopter. He was campaigning for President of the United States. He got them a water tank, which is up there today. S.E. Parrish, the leader, the Boli Maru leader, the last one at the time, led him into the roundhouse, gave him a basket, and the people were very excited, as many people were for Robert Kennedy. They saw a lot of hope in him, a man who was sensitive to the poor and others. And Essie said at that time, and she was a great prophet, she said, she called the people in after the helicopter and everybody took off. She said, he'll be dead in 3 weeks. I'm sorry to inform you. And as you know, he was assassinated then 3 weeks later. So, but the Kashaya are still there, and that's basically their history. And it's been ravaged by a lot of hard times, and the Mormon groups came in there, and families were warring against one another. It's a mini world. And again, what Indian people need to do, we've been homeless. All of us have been homeless. It's part of our culture. And what do you do when you're homeless? You're scared. You don't trust. And it also becomes the way you live. You become, in fact, you do things to keep yourself homeless and what you know. It is no different. So if we're used to disruption, even if we don't have it, we'll create it. The classic example is the young woman who intellectually says, I will never marry a man like my father who beat my mother or abused her. And she goes to a party and there's 100 guys, and the first one she picks is whom? The guy who beat her, because that registers at a deep level, home. That's what I know as home. So again, it's becoming conscious, and I talk to my people all the time about becoming conscious of these unconscious patterns that are a consequence of colonial trauma. And it's really, really important for all of us to think about. Because what stories do we live? What have we come to know? How have we learned to survive? Okay, I don't know if that helped. I'm a professor, I'll go on and on. But I can make it short. Yes?
Well, in the article that we read about the way you separate a group from family or from the land, you talk about that you lose, like you were saying, that you lost so many languages and so many stories and art and all that stuff. Did you regain anything? I mean, I know you are starting to speak some of the language again, but how did you regain it? Was there any documents that you found, like primary documents that you were able to keep and use for further education for generations?
The important thing is, yes, we have, what the miraculous thing is, despite the history that I gave you, there were people who remembered stories. Just like Tooch said, he remembers Nettie Smith. There's people who remember, and they remember hearing stories. We talked. I mean, Indian people, if we're good at nothing else, we talk. Maybe amongst ourselves. Boy, that gossip vine is unbelievable. I mean, we make Jewish people look quiet. So, I mean, I think we really, really talk a lot about ourselves and about history. For instance, we know who's related to who because we've been here. So I'll be sitting somebody and I'll say, oh, that's my uncle's grandmother's sister's father-in-law. And everybody's going, what? But again, we know we've watched who's married who because you've been here. And you know. So there are a lot of stories. But listen carefully. It's not that we have to go back and remake what we have. It's that we have to take what we have and use it to make a future with others. The tradition was always moving and changing to adapt to certain situations, right? So the old rituals that were there, the landscape, the text is gone. There's just shards of it left. If we were to walk out and look for our land, if somebody who passed away 200 years ago were to wake up and come forward, they would be lost. The landmarks are gone. Virtually everything's gone. All these creeks around here that dry up, they ran all year. Right? Trout everywhere. I'm old enough to remember we used to fish for steelhead at Farmers Lane and 4th Street, right below the bridge there. That was Tooch.
I kill 12 pheasant every year right here where we're sitting. This was the seed farm. Wide open, nothing here. Absolutely nothing.
Yeah, and I'm old enough to remember that too. I loved it during the protest of the casino when Rohnert Park people came up and they were saying, I'm 4th and 5th generation Rohnert Park. And I thought, what a fascinating culture. They have babies at 8. But again, I think the goal, to go back to your question, is an important one. How do we work together to restore the land? The land now has stories of the Spanish, of the Mexicans, and of all of us working together. Not necessarily all bad or bloody stories, but stories about people coming together and hopefully now working to survive. How do all of us as students in this class recreate a world where our children can live? Right? How do we create a home for our children? I don't want them to be like me. I don't want them to be scared and homeless and not wondering where they go or where you belong here or there. It's amazing. I ask, and I won't do it here, but I often ask my students, how many of you can name both sets of grandparents? And almost everybody can. But you get to those great-grandparents, and we are lost, right? We're moving, we're disconnected. And what goes with that? I'm not saying just come to Sonoma County and just never move. But again, one of the things I teach a class in memoir writing in place, and I make students keep a journal. Every week they have to do a little exercise. Find a piece of history, describe a physical place, pick a place, and go through all the ideas of all the things, notions of that place. And it's amazing. You know, they've never thought about a place that way. How textured, how layered it is. I mean, think of the fish and spirits and everything else that are swimming around you right now because of where you're sitting. And the deer and the elk. You know, there were elk and antelope all over here. It was huge herds of elk and antelope. And of course the deer. And the grizzly bears. There were more grizzly bears than there were people. And there were a lot of people, but the grizzly was the ruler of the land. All right? And again, mountain lions. And the first thing, of course, one of the Spanish and the Mexican, or the Californians began to do is kill anything that what? Threatened their livestock or cattle. So, again, many of those things went. People say, how did all the elk and deer disappear? There was, and pronghorn, the antelope that were here. Huge herds, tens of thousands, would just move across the landscape here. What happened is you had the whole western rim here was all big redwood forest. And the antelope, the pronghorn, and the elk wouldn't go in there. Why? The grizzly bear was in there. So when the early Mexicans and the Spanish and Mexican people came, they figured out that all they had to do is herd them to the edge of the plain and they'd stop. They'd have them like in a corral. They just shot them down that way. Yeah. Other questions? And some of our ancestors, I know, remember the elk. There were a few elk that were still around. The other thing that was quite amazing were the condors with those 13 and 14 wingspans that zoomed all around. The older brothers of the buzzards and vultures that fly around. A huge, big all around here. It was kind of interesting. Yes, question. Yeah.
Is there any geography that comes close to the way it was before the settlers came with their animals?
Okay, there's a good question. Is there any landscape that is around here that is much the way it was before the settlers came? I don't know of any. Remember, I mean, it's so radically different, Myrna, that at the time of contact, you could row across Bodega, Bodega Bay, yes, but San Francisco Bay and see all the way to the bottom. Right? So when they were rowing in the boats and the Thule boats, they would see the sharks and the salmon coming in and everything. You could see all the way through, right through to the bottom. And of course, the immediate thing is they began diking up everything to make place for farming. Interestingly, now all along 37, and we're involved with some restoration there, because of the rising waters, those dikes are all going to be going in the next 5 or 10 years. So we're going to have the ocean back in here unless we keep building higher and higher walls. What are we going to do? It's really interesting. It's quite interesting. They again bombed all the lakes. We were organized around water. Water was the thing everybody shared. And so if you were in the hills and you didn't take good care of the water to keep it clean and running into the lagoon people wouldn't let you go there to pick tule and other things. Right? So in the tule, if the lagoon people weren't taking care of the laguna, the people up in the hills would put poison in the water and poison it. So you had to respect water. Water had to do with everything. And the laguna out here was considered sort of the heart or the lungs of all the water, because water from the Russian River and all the streams went in and out of there, right? What was the first thing that the early Americans did? There were 3 very deep lakes there. They call them diamond lakes, but we didn't have diamonds, but sparkling lakes, I guess, in some of the Pomo languages. They bombed them, dynamited them to fill them in for farming. And then the second thing they did, Sebastopol and Santa Rosa, is dumped raw human sewage into the laguna. So the most sacred part of our area, the most sacred water, an important body part, was immediately fouled with feces. And now, as you've read, we're trying to restore it, but the Ludwigia is basically destroying what's left of the laguna. But, all these things are opportunities. These are great opportunities to do something. Yes?
So would you consider domestic farming the worst thing that happened to the California landscape and the Indian people?
Domestic farming, that's a very interesting thing. I grew up with cows and chickens and horses. I love them. They're here. Just like all of us are here now. We're going to have to work it out. When they came, that was part of a disruptive system. It would be hypothetical for me, maybe there could have been a way that they could have coexisted more easily or peacefully. But that was not the intention of the colonizers, right? Every square inch of the land was there for profit. And so they weren't interested in a viable relationship between the two. I think we can have that. I think we can have deer in the hills. I think we can have elk in the hills and cattle. I mean, what we need is, there's ways to do this. And chickens, we need those things now. But I think, and now we need to find ways to grow those things. I think the most important thing is to do it in a kind way. So when I was a kid, and some of those old folks in here were kids, the dairies were small, 50 or 100 cows. They lived in pastures, the cows. The chickens were on the ground, right? They ran around. Some of them got eaten by foxes. Yeah, that's the way it goes. All right, you had a more peaceful coexistence. Things have gotten more and more intense, and I worry that with the coming 10 billion people in the next 30 years, we're going to resort to even more extreme measures of agriculture.
Yeah, well, I'm a vegetarian, and one of the reasons I first became one is I was learning about how the farming, land for cows is being pushed into the rainforests, and they keep tearing down rainforests for, to make room for grazing cows, and it just seems like domesticated farmland is just like every place in the world. It seems like mass productions of it is destroying.
You mentioned the rainforest, and that is the latest version of what happened here. All it is an updated version of virtually what happened here and how radical it was. But we're here, all of that. Virtually all the human diseases we have, pneumonia, smallpox, all those things that came with Europeans, those are all syphilis. All those are a consequence of the last between 5,000 and 10,000 years of us living with domesticated animals. All the diseases, most of the diseases that we have are a consequence of living in close quarters with domestic animals, to having domesticated the animals. They have power. They've cursed us for generations.
How did we get syphilis from an animal? That's weird.
I think there's a lot of folks around you could answer that question. Was that circumspect, Myrna? Okay. All right. Other questions? Yes.
If there aren't any other students, ask questions. Okay.
That's all right. I don't privilege students.
Did you know Cher's other half was Armenian?
Cher's other half was Armenian. Yes, I did. Cher Sarkisian.
Genocide on both sides. Cheryl Sarkisian, right. Anyway,
Half-breed.
home.
Home.
Do you feel that Great Rancheria has enough home? I mean, have you received, or you keep, I mean, how do you get your land, how do you get your home back? I mean, besides the environmental, I understand all of that, but, you know.
You've asked a big question. Let me try to repeat it and answer it in kind of general terms, and because I know people are maybe getting antsy for their test, but it's class isn't quite over. That's what you always say, right now. How does Great Rancheria have enough home? I think it's important that we have a land base. I think it have programs where we restore and work on being home, because no matter how much property you have, no matter how you're trumped out, unless you're also home inside, you're never home. The most powerful nations on earth war the most. We're living in the most powerful, arguably the most powerful nation on earth right now. The crux of our economy is weapons. It's dependent on war. Okay, so how do simultaneously, and this is so important for my people, for Indian people, because again, we get distracted with the casino. We think if we have these material things, that somehow we're going to be secure. But the media and everything we've looked at has always told us that. They've sold us that. You can only sell you things if you're insecure and don't think you're home if you need something, right? Imagine how this economy would change if all of us in this room felt comfortable about ourselves. If it was okay to be 30 pounds overweight. If it was okay to be bald or old. By the way, this is the first culture in the history of human consciousness where youth is privileged over age. It's never happened anywhere else. And that's very important for a culture that has no home. It's the next spread of the cancer, because you cannot learn from the new, you can only learn from the old. And if you're always looking toward the new and shuffling aside the old, you preclude the opportunity to learn. Dangerous, dangerous, dangerous. And the youth culture that we're exporting via Hollywood is becoming ubiquitous in the world. In Asia, everywhere else. It is, in fact, the thing that is pushing their economies up. This need. And, in turn, destroying the environment. So, to answer your question, is there enough home for Grayton? I think if there's a family, that's important. If there's a place, that's important. But there has to be a home in our heart. Otherwise, there never will be a home. And no amount of land, no amount of money is ever going to buy that.